Police announced 19-year-old Sarah McLynn will now face murder charges in the death of her roommate.
Now, the 19-year-old roommate of 52-year-old Harold Sasko is accused of murder.
Prosecutors plan to seek a hard 50 prison sentence against a 19-year-old woman charged with killing a Lawrence man.
The life of Harold Sasko, a man who appeared to be a pillar of his community. As a well-known restaurant owner and respected figure in Lawrence, Kansas, Hal was seen as a model of success and organization. But beneath this polished exterior lay a darker side, one that would forever alter the life of an 18-year-old girl, Sarah Gonzalez McLynn. Hal was a man who thrived on control. Born into a large family, he learned early to take charge, and this trait followed him throughout his career. After opening several successful pizza restaurants, Hal's obsession with work drove a wedge between him and his wife, ultimately leading to their divorce. Despite his public image as a kind and caring leader, Hal's private life revealed a man whose ambitions overshadowed his responsibilities as a husband and father. In January 2014, the unthinkable happened. Hal, the man so deeply ingrained in his community, suddenly vanished. Employees at his pizzeria found the restaurant eerily empty, a sight that was highly unusual. Days passed without word from him, prompting concern and eventually leading the police to his home. What they found shocked even the most seasoned officers. Hal's lifeless body was discovered in his living room, lying face down in a pool of blood. His hands and feet were bound, and his neck bore a gruesome wound so deep it fractured the bone. This wasn't just a murder, it was a brutal execution. The chilling scene was further marked by the word "freedom" scrawled on the wall in Hal's own blood. But the horror didn't end there. As investigators pieced together the crime scene, they discovered a puzzling detail. Hal had been living with an 18-year-old girl, Sarah Gonzalez McLynn. Yet Sarah was nowhere to be found. Was she a victim, a witness, or perhaps something much darker? The search for Sarah became the authorities' top priority. Sarah's backstory provided a stark contrast to the controlled world Hal had built. Born into a loving family in Kansas, Sarah's life took a tragic turn when her parents divorced during her childhood. This instability left her vulnerable, and she became a target for predators. By her early teens, she had already endured unthinkable trauma, including molestation by a neighbor and an assault that left physical scars. These events led to a downward spiral of substance abuse and risky behavior, culminating in her attempt to leave home at just 14 years old. It was at this vulnerable stage in her life that Sarah met Hal. She started working at his pizzeria, where his reputation among employees was anything but wholesome. Hal's preference for hiring young, attractive women was an open secret, and his controlling tendencies extended to his management style. For Sarah, Hal initially appeared as a savior, offering her a job and eventually a place to stay when her personal life unraveled. But what seemed like a lifeline soon became a nightmare. Hal's initial kindness masked a more sinister intent. After taking Sarah into his home, he began to exert control over her life in increasingly disturbing ways. From buying her drugs and alcohol to pressuring her into cosmetic surgeries, Hal manipulated Sarah into a state of complete dependence. As her debt to him grew, so did his demands, culminating in a deeply inappropriate relationship that left Sarah feeling trapped and powerless. The events leading up to Hal's murder paint a chilling picture of a young woman pushed to her breaking point. Trapped in a toxic cycle of abuse and manipulation, Sarah's mental health deteriorated. She became isolated from her family and friends, her sense of self eroded by Hal's relentless control. By the time she turned 18, the dynamic between them had shifted entirely. What began as a father-daughter-like relationship had morphed into something far more sinister. In the weeks before the murder, signs of Sarah's growing instability began to surface. A particularly disturbing incident involved her bringing home a pet rabbit, only to kill and skin it, leaving the carcass in the refrigerator. This act, ignored by those around her, foreshadowed the violence to come. The tension between Sarah and Hal reached a boiling point, leading to the gruesome events of January 17, 2014. According to Sarah's confession, Hal's murder was premeditated. After drugging him with a high dose of Ambien, she bound his hands and feet, ensuring he couldn't fight back. Then, with a hunting knife in hand, she carried out the act that would forever change both their lives. The word freedom painted on the wall was not just a message, it was a declaration of the emotional and psychological chains she believed she had broken. This case raises questions that challenge our understanding of justice and morality. Was Sarah a cold-blooded killer? Or was she a victim driven to extremes by years of trauma and manipulation? The line between predator and prey blurs in this deeply unsettling story, leaving us to grapple with the complexities of human behavior and the consequences of unchecked power. Let's revisit the aftermath of Sarah Gonzalez McLynn's chilling act, exploring not only the trial and public reaction, but the broader implications of her case. When Sarah was arrested, her confession left no room for ambiguity. She admitted to drugging Hal, binding him, and slitting his throat in what she described as an act of desperation. Yet the story behind that moment revealed a harrowing journey of trauma, manipulation, and an increasingly blurred line between victim and perpetrator. The trial began with a media frenzy, as the details of the crime and Sarah's life unraveled in court. Prosecutors depicted her as a cold-blooded killer who had meticulously planned Hal's murder. They highlighted her calculated escape, the careful way she laced Hal's drink with Ambien, and her chilling confession that described the murder with eerie clarity. The blood-stained message scrawled on the wall, "Freedom," was used as a symbol of her intent, showing she believed this act would liberate her. On the other side, the defense worked to contextualize Sarah's actions, framing her as a victim who had been pushed to an extreme breaking point. They brought forward testimony about her traumatic childhood, including abuse and neglect following her parents' divorce, and the predatory behavior she experienced from multiple men throughout her formative years. The years she spent living with Hal, they argued, were the culmination of these experiences, a spiral of control, coercion, and emotional abuse that left Sarah feeling there was no escape. Psychologists took the stand to testify about the toll Hal's manipulation had on Sarah's psyche. The defense painted a damning portrait of Hal as a man who preyed on Sarah's vulnerability, grooming her from a young age and isolating her from her family. They revealed how he financed surgeries to modify her appearance, coerced her into an exploitative sexual relationship, and trapped her under the weight of an insurmountable financial debt. For Sarah, the defense argued, every aspect of her life was controlled by Hal. In her mind, the only way out was through an act of finality. To further emphasize Sarah's fragility, the defense outlined her mental health struggles, exacerbated by years of abuse. Diagnosed with severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, Sarah had been prescribed antidepressants to manage her condition. Yet even these medications, paid for by Hal and added to her growing debt, became another tool of control in his hands. The defense sought to explain how Sarah's mental state, combined with her environment, led her to believe that murder was her only option. Public reaction to the trial was deeply divided. On one side, people empathized with Sarah's plight, seeing her as a young woman trapped in a horrific situation and abandoned by a system that should have protected her. Advocates for abuse survivors rallied behind her, arguing that her actions, while extreme, were born out of desperation and years of psychological torment. They criticized the legal system for its failure to account for the impact of long-term abuse on a person's mental state and decision-making. On the other side, many viewed Sarah as a dangerous individual who had taken another person's life in a premeditated and gruesome manner. They pointed to the calculated nature of the crime, her purchase of the Ambien, the methodical way she restrained Hal, and her cold decision to flee the scene as proof of her intent. To these individuals, Hal's reprehensible behavior did not justify murder, and Sarah's actions warranted severe punishment. One of the most gripping moments of the trial came when Sarah herself took the stand. Tearfully, she recounted her life story, starting with the trauma of her parents' divorce and the abuse she suffered as a child. She described her initial perception of Hal as a kind and supportive figure, someone who seemed to care about her well-being. But as her testimony continued, she revealed the darker side of their relationship, the controlling behavior, the emotional manipulation, and the coercive sexual dynamic that developed after she turned 18. Sarah's testimony was raw and emotional, leaving many in the courtroom visibly shaken. She spoke of feeling trapped and powerless, unable to leave because of the financial and emotional stranglehold Hal had over her. She described how she would drink and take drugs to detach herself from the situation, trying to survive what felt like an inescapable nightmare. Her voice cracked as she explained the moment she decided to kill Hal, describing it as an act of self-preservation rather than revenge. The jury faced an incredibly difficult decision. The prosecution had presented a strong case for premeditated murder, supported by Sarah's confession and the deliberate nature of her actions. Meanwhile, the defense had painted a picture of a vulnerable young woman pushed to the brink by years of abuse. The verdict would need to balance the brutality of the crime against the context in which it was committed. Ultimately, Sarah was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 50 years. The sentence was a polarizing outcome. For some, it was a just punishment for a heinous crime. For others, it was a devastating blow to a young woman who had already endured so much suffering. Advocacy groups called the verdict a failure to recognize the complexities of trauma and abuse, arguing that Sarah's actions could not be separated from the years of exploitation she had endured. In the years following her sentencing, Sarah's case became a touchstone for discussions about abuse, trauma, and justice. It highlighted the gaps in the legal system's understanding of the psychological effects of long-term abuse and the challenges faced by victims seeking to escape their abusers. Her story inspired calls for reforms, including better support systems for survivors and greater consideration of abuse-related trauma in criminal cases. Sarah herself expressed deep remorse for her actions, stating in interviews that she wished she had found another way to escape Hal's control. From prison, she has worked to raise awareness about the impact of abuse, hoping to prevent others from finding themselves in similar situations. Her story remains a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked power and control, as well as the urgent need for intervention in cases of abuse. This case forces us to confront difficult questions. How do we balance accountability with empathy in cases involving abuse? What role does trauma play in shaping a person's actions? And how can society better protect vulnerable individuals before they reach a breaking point? While the answers may not be simple, Sarah's story serves as a powerful catalyst for reflection and change. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the case of Sarah Gonzalez McLynn. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe for more explorations of complex true crime cases. And share your thoughts in the comment section. Also, don't forget to share it with your friends. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.